Our bodies have a complex set of regulatory mechanisms for our blood. When bleeding is present, it's important that the characteristics of our blood change and a cascade of reactions take place in an attempt to slow and stop the bleeding and really conserve blood loss. There's many different steps to this whole process, but one of the more complicated ones is the Clotting Cascade, which I'll discuss now. Alright you guys, welcome back to another video lesson from ICU Advantage. My name is Eddie Watson, and my goal is to give you guys the confidence to succeed in the ICU by making these complex critical care subjects easy to understand. I truly hope that I'm able to do just that, and if I am, I do invite you to subscribe to the channel down below. When you do, make sure you hit that bell icon and select all notifications so you never miss out when I release a new lesson. As always, the notes for this lesson as well as all the previous videos are available exclusively to the YouTube and Patreon members. You can find links to join both of those down in the lesson description below. Also, don't forget to head over to ICUadvantage.com or follow that link down in the lesson description to take a quiz on this lesson, test your knowledge while also being entered into a weekly gift card. As well as don't forget that you can help support this channel through the purchase of an ICU Advantage sticker. Again, those are found at the website ICUadvantage.com/support, link down in the description. Alright, so we got a lot to cover in this lesson, so let's kick things off and start talking about hemostasis. So really, in order to understand the role of the clotting cascade, we do need to have a basic understanding of hemostasis or the cessation of bleeding. So I'll probably do a future lesson where I actually look at this more in depth, but in general, our blood remains relatively thin in a liquid form to allow it to move freely throughout the body. There are a variety of mechanisms in place to ensure that our blood remains thin. When we have a blood vessel that is damaged or bleeding is occurring, the blood really needs to thicken to try to slow or stop that bleeding from that damaged vessel. This thickening of the blood is known as clotting or coagulation. Essentially, the blood is going to change from a liquid to a gel. Now, I'm sure you've probably seen this with a blood sample maybe that's been left out in a syringe or something for more than a few minutes, and you see that plasma separate out, and then the blood itself forms that gelatinous clot. So the first step in stopping this bleeding is something that we call primary hemostasis, and it really involves the blood vessel itself and platelets. So initially, the vessel is going to initiate a local vasoconstriction, and this is to try to reduce the flow of blood to the affected area. Next, we have platelet aggregation, where essentially platelets begin to collect at the site of damage. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this here, but eventually, if the damage isn't too extensive, then enough platelets sort of come together and form something that we refer to as the platelet plug. This platelet plug is primarily what's responsible for this slowing or stopping of the bleeding from that damaged vessel. Now, from there, we move on to the next step, which we call secondary hemostasis, which involves a complex set of reactions that help to strengthen the platelet plug and form what we refer to as a clot. And this secondary hemostasis is actually what we call the clotting cascade. Now, the way that the clotting cascade actually helps to strengthen this platelet plug and really for the clot is a result of these structural fibers that hold the clot together, and it really all revolves around something called fibrin. So here we have the suffix "in", which means that it is a protein, and then we have fiber at the beginning, which is really what's responsible for the fiber. So it's a protein that's responsible in making these fibers. And so fibrin itself is actually just a monomer, just a single protein here that when we chain them together, we form something that we call a fibrin polymer or a fibrin strand. So they sort of line up back to back and form this long fibrin strand. And then from there, these fibrin strands also get linked together to form something that we refer to as the fibrin mesh. And this is really what gives the clot its strength. Now, fibrin itself, though, is not readily available in the blood, and this is really to prevent the blood from just coagulating when it's not needed. Its precursor, though, which is something that we refer to as fibrinogen, so here we've got, again, fibrin at the beginning, and then gen for genesis or creation of fibrin, sort of the precursor to fibrin, and this is readily available in the blood, and it needs to be activated when vessel damage occurs and hemostasis is needed. Alright, so the end goal we know is the production or activation of fibrin and fibrin strands. So let's talk about the clotting cascade itself. And this is something that we do also refer to as the coagulation cascade, and the terms can be used interchangeably. I am going to be going over the entire clotting cascade, but it is going to be broken down into several parts as it is something that's quite complex. In addition to being broken down into different parts, I'll also cover a decent amount of detail here, but the physiology and biochemistry actually goes even deeper than what I'm going to be discussing. For practical applications though in the ICU, knowing and memorizing each and every step of the clotting cascade is not really something that's necessary. It is, however, important to understand how it all works because we can encounter alterations to this at various points, and this can be whether it's from genetic disorders, body composition, diet, or from a slew of various different medications that we often encounter on a daily basis. As mentioned, the end game of our clotting cascade is to convert fibrinogen to fibrin and then form the fibrin strands and fibrin matrix to stabilize the clot. And fibrin is actually what was first identified as playing a role in clot formation. And in fact, the history of coagulation and understanding all of this really goes all the way back to antiquity. And a lot of the initial discoveries were in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s. But obviously in the 1900s, the mid to late 1900s is really when a lot of our understanding of some of the deeper aspects of coagulation came into view. So like I said, fibrin was the first thing that was identified in playing a role in this clot formation. Therefore, fibrinogen, the precursor of fibrin, is also known as factor 1. And when we list out these factors, they're all written out using Roman numerals. And then fibrin itself is then known as activated factor 1. Now, in this lesson, I am going to be talking about many different factors, and their numbering is really based on the order in which they were discovered or really identified in playing a role in this clotting cascade. Some of the numbers kind of make sense as you'll see as we go along, but some of them just don't, and just think of it as it was a matter of when they were discovered and when they were named. Alright, so knowing that this fibrin strand and fibrin mesh is our end goal, you'd think the easiest way to get this coagulation happening would be to have some biomarker that would be expressed whenever tissue is damaged, and then those biomarkers could be responsible for converting fibrinogen to fibrin. And this would be simple and quick, and in a way this does happen, kind of. So damaged tissue does actually produce something called tissue factor on its membrane. This tissue factor is something that we also refer to as factor 3. And don't forget about this tissue factor, factor 3, because I will discuss this more in just a minute. The problem is that while this is simple and quick, by using a 1-to-1 type of reaction like this, so one molecule of factor 3 can at one time only convert one thing of fibrinogen to fibrin, our bodies really would not be able to make enough fibrin to stop the bleeding. And so our bodies needed to develop a system that could rapidly convert large volumes of fibrinogen over to fibrin to then be used to make these fibrin strands and ultimately the fibrin mesh. And this is really where the concept of a cascade comes in. The best way to kind of think about this is if you had a group of people who wanted to build a house, it would go quicker if each person had more friends to help. And it would go even faster if each of their friends also invited more friends to come help as well. This is the basic concept of the cascade. By having more cascading steps, we eventually lead to more fibrin being activated. So now, to help speed up the activation of fibrinogen to fibrin, it was later discovered that another protein named thrombin, so again, suffix "in" for protein, thrombin being that its essential purpose is to form a thrombus or a clot, and that this was actually responsible for activating fibrinogen to fibrin. And so what happens is thrombin combined with a calcium ion, so here I want you thinking ionized calcium, that this is what activates that fibrinogen over to fibrin. Thrombin itself also starts out as an inactive factor, something that we call prothrombin, which is also known as, you guessed it, factor 2, making thrombin activated factor 2. Now, in order to cascade even more and to enlist more helpers in eventually producing those large volumes of fibrin, we have something called the prothrombin activator complex. So this complex rapidly converts prothrombin to thrombin, which then obviously goes on to convert fibrinogen to fibrin. This prothrombin activator consists of two additional factors, activated factor 10 and activated factor 5. these two different factors, after being activated, along with, once again, calcium ions, are what drive this conversion of prothrombin into its active form thrombin. And so, hopefully so far you can see a couple of themes. So almost all of our factors are going to need to be activated from their standard form. And these factors are going to be present in the blood and are mostly produced by the liver. Ionized calcium plays a very important role in many steps of this coagulation process, along with other biological processes too. And this is different from regular calcium, which is great for storage in bones, but it's really not bioavailable unless it's in its ionized form. Therefore, we really care more about an ionized calcium level than a regular calcium level. And this is something that you've probably seen in the ICU so far. And because of its importance here on the clotting cascade, calcium is also referred to as factor 4. And now, finally, while fibrin strands alone help to support this platelet plug and ultimately this clot formation, these individual strands alone are actually pretty weak. They wouldn't last long on their own, so we actually have to strengthen these strands by connecting them to each other through crosslinks. So in comes another factor, and this was actually the last one discovered by our numbering system, and this one's called fibrin stabilization factor, aka activated factor 13. Now, factor 13 itself does require activation by thrombin, and then activated factor 13 then attaches fibrin strands to one another, sort of forming these crosslinks, something that we refer to as this fibrin mesh. And this is what really gives the clot its strength. So, wow, you're probably thinking, you're right, this is pretty complicated with all these factors and activations and conversions. Again, the whole goal of this cascade, this process, is to enlist more and more helpers to be able to ultimately convert more fibrinogen to fibrin as quickly as possible. That said, especially after this last example with factor 13, you've probably noticed that a lot of numbers of factors that I actually haven't mentioned yet. Yep, so this definitely is not all of the clotting cascade. In fact, all of what I've just shown you is something that we refer to as the common pathway of the clotting cascade. So from the point of conversion of factor 10 to activated factor 10, this is the start of the common pathway. And as you can guess, there's actually different ways in which we can activate factor 10. These two different ways that we do this, we call the extrinsic pathway and the intrinsic pathway. So let's start off talking about the extrinsic pathway. And here, this pathway is also known as the tissue factor pathway. This pathway is actually initiated by damage to the tissue and the vasculature, allowing blood to come into contact with the tissue. This tissue actually expresses that tissue factor, aka tissue thromboplastin, aka factor 3. Remember, I said I'd talk about this one again. And then circulating in our blood, we have a large volume of something that we call factor 7. When factor 7 encounters tissue factor, it activates into active factor 7. Then this tissue factor activated factor 7 complex, in the presence of, once again, calcium ions, in turn converts factor 10 to active factor 10, starting the common pathway. That's right. Now, in addition to tissue factor activating factor 7, 7 can also be activated by thrombin itself, as well as activated factor 10, as well as a couple others that I will discuss here shortly. Because we have a large volume of factor 7 in the blood, this short extrinsic pathway ultimately allows for rapid activation of fibrin. And this actually helps to create a more stable platelet plug in about 15 to 30 seconds. And in cases of bleeding that are the result of trauma, damage to the vessel, we can really think of this as the starting point for the initiation of the clotting cascade. As the rest of the common pathway gets activated, there is a positive feedback that acts back on this activation of factor 7, like I mentioned with that thrombin and activated factor 10, that ultimately help to potentiate this whole cascade. Alright, so that was the extrinsic pathway. That one's actually pretty simple and straightforward. Next, we're going to talk about the intrinsic pathway. And the intrinsic pathway is also known as the contact activation pathway, and this pathway is triggered by either inflammation and or damage to blood cells or endothelial cells. and oftentimes is the result of blood being exposed to collagen of the subendothelial layer. So all the components that are required for this pathway are actually contained in the blood, hence its name intrinsic, meaning from within. Remember that our extrinsic requires that tissue factor that's going to come from outside tissue. So once this pathway is initiated, factor 12 becomes activated. And then when it combines with various cofactors, it in turn converts factor 11 to active factor 11. Then we have the active form of factor 11 along with, once again, calcium ions that then acts on factor 9, activating it to active factor 9. Now, one interesting thing to note is that active factor 12 and activated factor 11 also are responsible for activating factor 7 from that extrinsic pathway. So again, this is going to help potentiate that cascade as well. So then from there, activated factor 9 then in turn activates factor 8 into activated factor 8. And then together combines with factor 8 along with our platelet phospholipids and once again those calcium ions to form a complex that then activates factor 10, again becoming a part of the common pathway. Whew. So the intrinsic pathway has a lot more steps involved in its cascade. As a result, we think of this as the slower secondary response, and this can take anywhere from 1 to 6 minutes to fully realize. That said, though, because our analogy, if you remember, of those helpers and that cascade, we end up being able to produce a much larger amount of fibrin eventually, which is needed to fully stabilize that clot via that fibrin mesh. Therefore, this is also referred to as the amplification phase of the clotting cascade. So as we kind of zoom out, this is the whole clotting cascade, both our extrinsic and our intrinsic pathways coming together, meeting up with the common pathway. Now, one thing you'll notice if you go through all these is there's actually no factor 6. And I really couldn't find a lot of information about this, and most references really refer to this as being unassigned. But of interesting note, I did see one mention of factor 6 also being activated factor 5, and makes me wonder if at some point in the past they misidentified this as another factor before determining that was just the activated form of factor 5. Other than that, we can spell out all of the factors 1 through 13, and we have them all identified. Some of them, though, aren't always proteins in the cases of the calcium ions. Now, as I already mentioned, with several of the factors so far, they also activate various other factors to help to potentiate the overall cascade. Now, in addition, thrombin also acts on factor 9, as well as the conversion of factor 5 to activated factor 5. And this is in addition to obviously the fibrinogen to fibrin conversion, as well as the factor 13 conversion that we talked about already. And so all of this really is a complex set of interactions, and the main goal being that as quickly as possible, as well as in the largest volume possible, to create as much fibrin to be available as needed to slow or stop the bleeding. As you can see, there are various different points at which we can either have an alteration in these factors. Think here liver disease, our different hemophilias, as well as many different spots where different anticoagulants can interact and inhibit this cascade as well. Another thing of note that vitamin K also plays a very important role in the liver for the maturation of these different factors, specifically factor 2, factor 7, 9, and 10. And again, it's not important for you to memorize this cascade, but like I said, it is helpful to kind of understand how it all works and why in some situations we may choose one anticoagulant over another. And in addition to the different anticoagulant usage, we also have different coagulation studies that look at different parts of this clotting cascade. The two most common ones that you're going to use are going to be the prothrombin time, so our PT, and this is typically expressed in that international normalized ratio, so our PT-INR, and this looks at our extrinsic pathway. Then we have our activated partial thromboplastin time, or our APTT, and this actually looks at our intrinsic pathway. Whew, all right, so we covered a lot of information here with this clotting cascade. I'm sure your heads are probably still spinning a little bit, so definitely come back and rewatch this at some point if you want a little bit better understanding. But hopefully you can kind of see that we have this complex process that's in place when our body needs to have that hemostasis. We need to stop that bleeding or slow that bleeding down. And the best way to do that is by forming this platelet plug and then reinforcing that plug with a fibrin mesh around it. The way we get all the fibrin for that involves a couple different ways through either the extrinsic or intrinsic pathways coming together through that helper analogy to get as many things on board to try to produce as much fibrin, thus as many fibrin strands, and ultimately a big strong fibrin mesh. So I hope that you guys found this information useful. If you did, please leave me a like on the video down below. It really helps YouTube know to show this video to other people out there, as well as leave me a comment down below. I love reading the comments that you guys leave, and I try to respond to as many people as I can. Make sure you subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and a special shout out to the awesome YouTube and Patreon members out there. The support that you're willing to show me and this channel is truly appreciated, so thank you guys so very much. If you'd be interested in showing additional support for this channel, you can find links to both the YouTube and Patreon membership down below. Head on over there and check out some of the perks that you guys get for doing just that, as well as check out some of the links to other nursing gear, as well as some awesome t-shirt designs I have down there as well. Make sure you guys stay tuned for the next lesson that I release. Otherwise, in the meantime, here's a couple awesome lessons I'm going to link to right here. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great day.